What's your take on this attack on the Al-Shifa hospital? Have Hamas been using this hospital to facilitate their attack on Israelis?
Well, the fact that you asked that question means that it's not a known. And because it's not a known, everything that Israel's doing is a war crime. You see, yes, under international humanitarian law, there are conditions in which a civilian object, such as a hospital, can be converted into a military object. And amongst those are if a hostile force is using it as a command and control point to barracks troops, to store ammunition, things of this nature. But in the law of war, there's also there's a criteria called distinction, meaning that in order to make a distinction between civilian and military, you have to have proof. You don't get to attack a hospital, then go on a fishing expedition to look for proof. That's not how the law of war works. You have to have absolute proof, or otherwise the object must be treated as a exclusively civilian object protected under international humanitarian law. As we see right now, Israel doesn't have proof. They're desperately searching for something that can back up the extraordinary claims they made about Al-Shifa. It's big, huge command and control underneath there, bunkers everywhere, guns, the whole thing. Where is it, Israel? Where is it? The fact that you're looking for it means you didn't know for certain it was there. You're guessing, and therefore you're guilty of murder, mass murder, a war crime. Every Israeli officer, every Israeli civilian authority associated with the attack on this hospital is guilty of a war crime and should be prosecuted as such. This isn't an accident. This isn't a mistake. The law of war is clear, and Israel has violated it 100%. People need to get angry. People need to start getting angry. I'm tired of people going, well, we're just going to have a civil discussion. Imagine your child dead right now in the hospital. Imagine your mother going in for surgery and dying in the recovery room because she can't get the medical care she needs. It's time for everybody to get angry. Israel no longer gets a pass. This isn't about anti-Semitism. I'm not anti-Semitic. This is about calling out a regime, the Netanyahu regime, as a war criminal regime. And they must be recognized as such and treated as such. And I'm telling every Israeli pilot right now, we may not know your names because you're protected by the Israeli defense establishment, but we know the date you dropped your bombs. And one day justice will come to you because the records are clear. You climbed into a cockpit and you received an order and you executed that order, and you are responsible for the due diligence of the target that you're striking. You are responsible. And if you know that you're carrying out an act of violence as part of the indiscriminate bombing, the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, you have committed a war crime by definition, and you will be found out and you will be held guilty, just like every Israeli officer on the ground in Gaza right now. Hey, you battalion commanders, if you have snipers under your command and they're in schools shooting children, you're guilty. You're guilty. They're all guilty, and it's time we call them out for what they are. You know, I have been accused of condemning the Germans in World War II for what the Nazis did. And people said, well, there were good Germans. They were just German soldiers doing their job. Maybe you can make that case, but you can't collectively say that because the Germans knew what they were getting into and the soldiers knew what they were fighting for. And at some point in time, it becomes evident that you are participating in a massive crime against humanity. This is why German generals, not SS officers, German generals were hung by the neck until dead, because they turned a blind eye to these crimes they were responsible, that took place under their command, even though they didn't give the orders. I hope and pray that someday there's a Nuremberg tribunal for these Israeli officers. And I want to see the look in their eyes as they're led up to the gallows, wondering in their mind what's going on as feel the noose around their neck, knowing they only have seconds to live before the executioner pushes a button, their neck is snapped, because that's all they deserve. They don't deserve our adulation. They don't deserve our admiration. They don't deserve our sympathy. They deserve our mass condemnation for the criminals that they are. It's disgusting what's happening right now in Palestine. And this has nothing to do with Hamas. Nothing to do with Hamas. It has everything to do with Israel's national decision-making cycle, which mainstreams collective punishment, which singles out every single civilian in Gaza as an extension of Hamas, and that is a crime, a crime, a crime. And if you're a pro-Israeli person in the streets demonstrating for them, shame on you, because this isn't about protesting against anti-Semitism. If it was about protesting against anti-Semitism, I'd be marching alongside, because there's no room for anti-Semitism, especially now. This is not a Jewish problem. The Jews are not to blame. Stop pointing the fingers at the Jews. This is about Zionism, political Zionism. This is about people who have taken political Zionism and they've turned it into this expression of a greater Israel. Eretz Israel. Show me anywhere in international law where the global community has green-lighted greater Israel. Nobody has. It's only in the sick fantasy of the Israeli leaders who govern Israel today. And if you're an Israeli fighting for Israel, you're not fighting for the defense of Israel as defined by the United Nations, as defined by 1948 or even 1967. You are fighting for a greater Israel, which means that you are saying we encourage a war of aggression against all of our neighbors, not just the Palestinians. This is a criminal regime. This is a sick regime, and it has to go. That doesn't mean that Israel has to go, but Eretz Israel is finished. Needs to be finished, needs to be killed. And the whole world needs to rally around this cause. I'm ashamed of the Arab world right now. I'm ashamed of the Muslim world. They had an opportunity. They had that joint extraordinary meeting in Riyadh last Saturday where they had a chance to squeeze Israel dead with an oil embargo. And they chose not to, which means that they have chosen money and profit over Palestinian blood. So, yeah. This condemnation is across the board for the leaders in Saudi Arabia, for the leaders in Turkey, because Erdogan may be out there saying the right thing, but he's allowing Turkey to transport Azeri oil over a pipeline onto ships in Turkish ports where they're sent to Israel to fuel the war machine. So Erdogan, you're a hypocrite. Shut the oil and I'll listen to you. Sisi, you better mobilize all your divisions and put them on the border with Israel and tell them that you are marching to Jerusalem if this doesn't stop. The king of Jordan, the same. Make Jerusalem yours again. Reverse 1967. Syria, take the Golan Heights. It's time for Israel to be terminated as a political Zionist state, because until it is, these crimes will continue. The Palestinians mean nothing. Their lives mean nothing. We're at the point now where numbers mean nothing because they become so big, you can't really attach a human face to them. It's just a figure on a piece of paper.
When you step back and look at October 7th, what was the reality of that day?
Well, let's start with the name of the operation, Al-Aqsa Flood. Why does there have to be an Al-Aqsa flood? What is Al-Aqsa? It's a holy place in Jerusalem, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, third holiest place in Islam. Why would Hamas have to name an operation Al-Aqsa Flood? Or could it be because the Israelis had for the past months, years, been desecrating the third holiest shrine in Islam? Could it be that the Israelis were disrupting Islamic worshipers, throwing tear gas into a mosque, beating up women, bullying men? Maybe that's why it happened. Maybe the Palestinians were tired of being surrounded by a fence and surrounded. You know, there's a lot of people don't know this. They're like, Gaza isn't occupied. Really? What is the CLA? What is Kogat? These are two Israeli entities that control everything that happens inside Gaza. Nothing goes into Gaza unless it's approved by the CLA or Kogat. That means that you have to submit paperwork that gets approved by the Israelis, and the Israelis deny everything because they're in control. Nothing happens in Gaza unless the Israelis deem it fit to happen. That is the definition of occupation. And you ask, why did they do it on October 7th? Now, I'm an American. I come from a tradition that says, you oppress me, I take you out and declare my independence. We did it to the British tyranny. We beat the crown. They called us terrorists. Some of us were. Samuel Adams, a documented terrorist. You know, Paul Revere could be accused of a terrorist. Now, these are great patriots in the American mind because we believe that we were right. The British believe we were wrong. We beat the British. We got our independence. How is Palestine going to get their independence? Who's going to give it to them? No one. We know that. On October 6th, no one was talking about a genuine two-state solution. It was done, finished. Goodbye, des vidania. The Saudi Arabians were talking about normalizing relations with the Israelis. They had forgotten about their precondition, about the necessity of a Palestinian state existing. Oh, we'll talk about it. No one's going to talk about it because once you normalize relations, it all becomes about the money, the money, the money. Everybody's focused on the India, Middle East economic corridor, going from Mumbai through Dubai up through Saudi Arabia onto Jordan to Israel, Haifa onto Greece. That was it. Joe Biden made it the signature element of his G20 summit. Netanyahu stopped talking about the Iranian bomb in the United Nations long enough to brag about this, and Israel's rolling it. No one was talking about a Palestinian state. No one cared about the Palestinians. Definitely not the president of the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas, one of the most corrupt men in the world. And Fatah, what have they become? They become a mafia group that basically steals money meant to benefit the Palestinian people, puts it in their own pocket, builds villa after villa after villa after villa. The Palestinian people had been forgotten. Only one entity was speaking out for them. One. And it wasn't Hezbollah, and it wasn't Iran. They give words, they give words, they give words. Only one. Hamas. Hamas launched an attack against Israel on October 7th. Because if they had failed to do so, there would never be a Palestinian state. Regardless of what you think about what Hamas did on October 7th, you must acknowledge the following. Everybody's talking about a Palestinian state now. Everybody's saying that this has to be part of the political solution. That's a huge victory for the Palestinian people, which means it's a huge victory for Hamas. You call Hamas a terrorist organization, but you ignore the fact that Israel encouraged Hamas to make the transition from being purely a resistance group into being a political party capable of governance. Israel helped fund Hamas's politicization. Hamas won an election in 2006. People tend to forget that. They won a democratic election. They won more votes than Fatah. They controlled the legislature. Now, that was an outcome that Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, couldn't accept. Israel didn't want to accept. My God, they wanted democracy, but not that kind of democracy. No, we don't want democracy where the will of the people is manifested. We want democracy that we control the outcome, but they didn't control that outcome. And it led to a civil war where Hamas won control over Fatah in the Gaza Strip. They lost control on the West Bank, but they won control in Gaza. Therefore, they are responsible for the governance of Gaza. Now, if you're put in charge of governing people, what kind of government are you if you allow the perpetration of crimes, the crimes of occupation? Because again, Scott, the settlements were withdrawn in 2005. The settlements were, but Israeli control was not. Israel controlled everything. Ask Hamas if they were able, as the governing authority, to build a true port capable of receiving international shipments. No, Israel wouldn't allow it. Israel wouldn't allow it. Ask Hamas if they could build an airport where planes could land so that Palestinians could fly freely around the world as sovereign citizens. No, Israel wouldn't allow it. Ask Hamas if they could do anything without Israel's approval. And the answer is only one thing: resist. And that's what a legitimate governing authority does when their people are being subjected to the oppression of the occupier, and that's Israel, an occupying authority. So Hamas struck out. Scott, Hamas committed crimes. Really? You guys do know, all the people that say that, and that in 2004, the International Court of Justice, which is sort of the body for the United Nations, for the global community to make final judgments about opinions regarding international law, determined that Israel was an occupying power and the Palestinians were an occupied people. And you do know, therefore, according to this 2004 opinion, that Israel has no inherent right of self-defense. The occupier can never, ever, under any circumstance, cite self-defense against actions that are derived from the occupied responding to the occupier. So, yeah, no, Hamas struck out as they should. And I'm telling everybody here, if you're a man or a woman worthy of the name, and you were a Palestinian living in Gaza, if you weren't with Hamas on October 7th, you stand for nothing. Nothing. Because it means you don't want a homeland. It means you want to live in perpetual slavery, perpetual serfdom. No, free men and free women would have supported Hamas on that day. And they should still support Hamas to this day, because Hamas is struggling against an illegitimate occupying authority, a war criminal nation. Never forget that Israel is not a nation of innocents. These are people who elected a government that has said, we will not allow a Palestinian state. You do know, we hear a lot of talk about from the river to the sea, Hamas's charter. Well, gosh, when was Hamas formed? I think in the late 80s, sort of came up in the late 80s and all that. When was the Likud party formed? In the early 50s. You know who invented from the river to the sea? The Likud party. It's part of their founding charter. And they believe it and they act it. They will never tolerate a Palestinian state. Their entire being is designed to defeat Palestine, erase Palestine, erase Palestine. All these Zionists, all these pro-Israeli people are going, where are they supposed to go? The 6 to 9 to 7 million Jews that are there, where are they supposed to go? Why the hell don't you think about the Palestinians? Where are they supposed to go? You're so willing to evict them and have them absorbed by countries around the world. Why the hell can't the tables turn? And I will tell you what, you Israelis, you pro-Israelis, there's only 7 million of you. And when the time comes and 1 billion anti-Zionists gather on your borders, maybe you guys should go read the story of Smyrna. Today it's known as Izmir in Turkey. Read the story of Smyrna. What happened to Smyrna at the end of World War I, at the end of the Greek invasion of Turkey, at the end of the Greco-Turkish War, where the Turks counterattacked and drove the Greeks into the ocean and basically said, Greece is that way. Swim or die. That's the future of Israel, if Israel isn't careful, because no one's going to care. Right now, there are people that do care. I care. I believe in Israel's inherent right to exist. But Israel is defined by the United Nations in 1948, or if we want to, we can modify it to 1967. I think the Oslo Accords talk about returning to the 1967 borders. So be it. That Israel has a right to exist because the international community has said it must exist. Who am I to go against the will of the international community? But the international community has never green-lighted Eretz Israel, never green-lighted Greater Israel. They've always spoken about the need, the necessity for a Palestinian state. And if Israel today is politically controlled by people who say that Palestine can't exist, and the only solution is that Israel can't exist, and Israel must be eliminated, Smyrna will be repeated. Maybe they'll write about it being Jaffa or Tel Aviv or Haifa. But one way or the other, the Israelis, the political Zionists, will either learn how to peacefully live with their Palestinian neighbors, or they will be driven into the sea.
How desperate is the Netanyahu administration to drag the US into a larger conflict in the Middle East?
Well, it's not just Netanyahu. The United States has been front-loaded to support Israel without question, regardless of the political leadership, for some time now. The last time we put the brakes on something like this was in 1990, 1991, during the Gulf War. The administration of George Herbert Walker Bush had famously stood up to the Israeli government and told them that, there's not a blank check here. But later on, under Bill Clinton, and then later on George W. Bush, and then Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Biden, that's changed. And Israel basically was given literally a blank check. The Israeli lobby took over control of Washington, D.C. The Arab lobby was dispersed. And we now find this situation where we're front loaded to give Israel anything they want. But I will tell you this. First of all, both Israel and the United States know that there can't be a war between Israel and Iran unless the United States is involved. We know that because we participated in joint exercises with Israel, Chariots of Fire last year, Firm Hand this year, where the various scenarios were tested out. And Israel lacks the capacity to attack Iran on a sustained basis without American assistance. And they need America to take over that conflict because they can't do it on their own. They literally can't do it on their own. And the problem is that they can initiate a strike against Iran, but then Iran will destroy all of Israel with precision-guided ballistic missiles. Not just Iran. There's a member of the Israeli cabinet, female member of parliament. She's a Likud party member. She has resigned against Netanyahu, and today she's saying that he has ruined Israel, and he has. She understands the truth. She knows the truth, that Hezbollah is sitting on thousands of precision-guided munitions. Precision-guided munitions meaning that they will strike a target within 3 meters of its intended, point of detonation. That means it's going through a window, and that these weapons are such that the Israelis can't intercept them. So if they're fired, they will hit what they're aimed at, and that will destroy Israel. She knows it. Netanyahu knows it. That's why he wants America involved. The only way he can defeat Hezbollah and Iran is if America takes the lead. That's the last thing the United States wants to do, however. We don't have the military capacity to defeat Iran. And the consequences of a long war with Iran would be devastating for the global economy because the oil production capacity of the Middle East will be terminated, some of it permanently so. We know this. Joe Biden, he wants to be president again. So he's not going to commit economic suicide by blindly supporting Israel. Netanyahu is finished. He's done. I just advise everybody, every time Netanyahu speaks, ignore it. And I'll tell you why. Because when this war ends, and it will end, Netanyahu will not be prime minister of Israel. He's a hated man, a reviled man. And he's recognized not only by the United States, but now increasingly so inside Israel, as the number one problem for Israel. It's not Hamas, it's Netanyahu. He failed the Israeli people on October 7th. He's supposed to be Mr. Security. He failed. And understand this, if he failed on October 7th, he's failed everywhere, which means he's miscalculated across the board, which means he doesn't have a plan. He simply panicked. This is panic reaction by the Israelis, which is one reason why they're committing so many crimes, because they just don't have any other thing they can do. They are so scared. They are so afraid. They are so panicked that they have allowed this panic to turn into bloodlust. And for them, it's bad. Not only does it expose them as a criminal state, but it also has turned global opinion against them. Let's be frank. Had Israel on October 8th limited its response to securing the border with Gaza, cleaning up the Hamas people, maybe a handful of punitive strikes against known Hamas targets inside Gaza, and then turned to the international community and cited Article 51, self-defense, and say, we've been attacked. We need the Security Council to step in. There would have been a heated debate because, again, the ruling of the International Court of Justice that Israel is an occupying power would have come up for debate, but Israel would have been able to counter that by pointing to the number of dead civilians and say that surely you can't deny us the opportunity to recognize that this was excessive violence on the part of Hamas. And I do believe that the Security Council would have sided on behalf of Israel, but it wouldn't have allowed this crime that's taking place. What it would have said is, that Hamas must go. And then you'd have the international community working with Israel to isolate Hamas, to eliminate Hamas. The streets would have been filled with protesters protesting for Israel and against Hamas. But that's not what happened. Netanyahu couldn't let that happen because remember, before October 7th, he was already a failing prime minister. There's a prime minister whose country was turning against him increasingly because of his decision to rewrite basic law, to turn the Israeli judiciary to an extension of a Likud-controlled parliament that would impeach any judge that dared hold Netanyahu accountable for the many crimes that he's been accused of committing, crimes of corruption, crimes that if he were found guilty, and he likely would be found guilty, would put him in jail and his wife for the rest of their lives. So he's a desperate man, literally trying to destroy Israel to save himself. That shows you what kind of despicable character this is. This is not a good man. This is not a misunderstood man. This is not a man who has been caught up in something bigger than him. He is a criminal, a literal criminal who's using the Israeli political system as a shield to protect himself from being held accountable for the crimes he has committed. And now he's committed more crimes. These war crimes are on Netanyahu. This is a man who has no support, no meaningful support in Israel. And I think you're going to see sooner rather than later that he will be removed from office and a new leadership will come in. And this will be largely because the United States is putting that pressure on them, because we recognize, and we see this with cables being sent from ambassadors around the world to Secretary of State Blinken to the White House, that the United States has lost the Arab world. They won't talk, they won't listen to us. We've lost their respect. It's over. That's all because of this Benjamin Netanyahu criminal in that's governing right now in Israel. So I think we're seeing a situation where the United States has had enough of Israel's crimes, and that the United States is going to begin holding Israel to account. And the best way to hold Israel to account right now is to push Netanyahu out and get an Israeli government in that will be willing to sit down and seriously discuss how to bring an end to this violence and how to promote a lasting peace that's inclusive of the existence of a Palestinian state, a legitimate Palestinian state, not a throwaway fake Palestinian state.
If you were an advisor to the Netanyahu administration right after that attack on October 7th, what would you say to them? What would be a smart choice to respond to that attack?
Well, if I were an advisor to Netanyahu, I would say that Hamas has carried out a very effective military raid against us. And we have to ask ourselves, what were they trying to accomplish? Hamas has stated three things: the creation of a Palestinian state, the freeing of 10,000 or 5 to 10,000 prisoners being held by Israel, many of them women and children, and the sanctity of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, the Netanyahu administration is familiar with all of this because they have said, we will not allow a Palestinian state, straight up won't allow it. We're encouraging greater Israel. We're not just refusing to have a Palestinian state. We want to eliminate Palestine altogether. They're not going to free the prisoners. And they view the Al-Aqsa Mosque as an impediment against, the next temple, the rise of the temple in Jerusalem. And so it's very hard as a military guy, but I would say that understand that this raid was designed to trigger our response, and therefore we must be in charge of our response so that Hamas isn't controlling this ship, that we are in control of this ship. So the first thing is we need to reseal the border to make sure Hamas can't do this again. We must ask ourselves, how did Hamas do what they did? And we have to make sure it doesn't happen again. Second of all, we have to eliminate any immediate threats to us. So if Hamas is launching rockets, I would authorize military strikes in to take out rocket launch sites and to take out command and control nodes if they can be identified. But the issue of distinction must come into play, as must proportionality. But then I would say that we need to find a way to understanding this, that Hamas isn't just a military organization, it's a governing authority and an ideology. And if we would learn from the Americans, we know now that you cannot bomb an ideology into extinction. In fact, the way you deal with these problems could actually enhance that ideology, strengthen that ideology. That if our goal is to weaken Hamas, we must not provide them with the fuel that will power the engine that makes them an even bigger entity. Today, Hamas is huge. Everybody's talking about Hamas. Demonstrators in the streets for Palestine, but indirectly for Hamas. They have more authority and legitimacy in the international community today than they had on October 6th. The Israelis have failed. They've done exactly what Hamas wanted them to do. Hamas took hostages, fell back into the Gaza metro, 500 kilometers of tunnels under the ground, and said, come and get us. And Israel did. And Hamas knew that Israel would use collective punishment because that is the written doctrine of Israel, the Dahiyah principle, named after that West Beirut suburb. And I'm sure I mispronounced that name and people are going to correct me. I apologize. But you know what I'm talking about. The point is, Israel did everything Hamas wanted them to do. And Hamas is winning this fight because war is an extension of politics by other means. This is a political fight. And Israel is losing the political fight. They can win all the little tactical victories on the ground that they want, but they're not destroying Hamas. They're not defeating Hamas, and they've lost politically. When you have the United States saying that Benjamin Netanyahu's got to go, you lost. When you have the world gathering around and condemning you, you've lost. So I would have told Netanyahu that we don't want to lose and that we have to view this as a political struggle, not just a military struggle. The military job right now is to contain the problem. The political job right now is to destroy Hamas. How do we do that? We do that by not playing their game. The first thing I would have done, and I've been advising the Israeli prime minister, is I would have turned to the United Nations and make an Article 51 appeal for the world to rally around our support. And then I would say that Israel is open to direct negotiations with Hamas about resolving this issue. Israel is open to direct negotiations with Hamas. That means that Israel's sitting at the table waiting. And there's a seat over there with a sign that says Hamas. And you invite Hamas to the table. Now, Hamas doesn't want to sit at that table. Hamas doesn't want to recognize Israel. And you just disenfranchised Hamas. You just delegitimized them in the eyes of the world because everybody's now looking at Hamas saying, you have to sit down, you have to talk. And if Hamas won't talk, Israel just won the political fight. And now the process comes to delegitimize Hamas and find something that can step in its stead, Fatah perhaps. And if I were the CIA, I would be encouraging a renewal of the Fatah-Hamas civil war. I would be telling the people of Palestine that Hamas can't govern. They have abandoned you. They have betrayed you. They have done everything bad against you. And it's time for the Palestinians to clean house. And I would encourage that to be taking place. There's a lot of things Israel could have done that would have maintained this. Now, for me, I'm glad they didn't because I believe in the defeat of Eretz Israel. I don't want a greater Israel, but I'm just telling you that there was a way to go about doing this, that Israel could have come out as the victor. Except Hamas knew that Israel wouldn't do that because Israel's incapable of doing that because Israel is a nation that's infused with hubris, with arrogance. The pride comes before the fall. And that's what Hamas was betting on, and it was a damn good bet. It wasn't even a gamble. Vegas wouldn't have given odds against Israel doing what they did because it's just an assured reaction, especially from a government as unthinking as Benjamin Netanyahu's. We knew what they were going to do. It was predicted, predictable. They're doing exactly this, and they're losing now because of it.
If the Netanyahu administration were capable of dragging the US into a larger conflict in the Middle East, how do you see the role of Turkey as a NATO ally?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I think nobody wants this war. Everybody's on to Israel's trick. Everybody's on to Israel's trick. So it would be the dumbest thing in the world for this thing to explode. The United States is doing unprecedented reaching out to Iran, telling them we don't want this war. And Iran is doing unprecedented reaching out to everybody else saying we don't want this war. A lot of pressure is being put on Hezbollah, who's in a very tight situation, to manage the escalation so it doesn't explode into war. And the United States is putting pressure on Israel, saying, don't you even think about opening up a northern front, which, of course, is an act of desperation that Netanyahu might do to hold on to power as his Gaza gambit fails. So I think we have to understand that any talk about a larger war is purely speculation. And it's, well, that doesn't mean it can't happen. Of course it can't happen. All the pieces are there. The emotions are running high. One miscalculation. My God, if one of these Iraqi or Syrian resistance missiles, mortars, lands on an American base and kills 25 soldiers, not wounds, kills 25 soldiers, hell's going to come. Hell's to pay. We won't take that. And then we have the real risk of major war. But nobody wants that war. Everybody's on to Netanyahu's treachery. You know, Turkey is a NATO ally. This has nothing to do with NATO, nothing to do with NATO whatsoever. This is purely a Middle Eastern problem. And the United States is not going to go to war against Turkey if Turkey intervened against Israel. That's an Israeli problem. We will continue to provide arms, munitions, etc. But we're not going to intervene to save Israel. We're not going to put American boots on the ground. First of all, what's Turkey going to do? It's very difficult. I mean, is the Turkish Air Force going to mass its aircraft and strike Israel? That would be foolhardy because Israel has some potential to strike back. There's no common border between Turkey and Israel. Or, Turkey can't send troops. Where are they going to send troops through Syria? No, they don't have good relations with the Syrians. Through Iraq, that ain't going to happen either. Through Lebanon, nope. So I think right now we just have a lot of muscle flexing by Turkey, but there's no real threat of a Turkish-Israeli confrontation. The big threat comes from Iran, and the United States is doing everything in its power to make sure the Iranians know we don't want this war. And so you're going to see we're turning on Netanyahu. We don't want him in power, and we're going to put whatever pressure we can to get him removed from power.
How do you see this excitement in the US, especially among Republicans, that they're talking about bombing Iran, let's fight Iran. Iran is the main source of these problems in that region. How do you see this? Is that a viable choice for the US?
Yeah, we're in no position to fight Iran right now, none whatsoever. Back in 2020, I believe it was, the Iranians shot down a Global Hawk drone, an American drone, over the Strait of Hormuz, and the Trump administration was talking about retaliating. Maybe it was 2019. They were talking about retaliating, and the Pentagon drew up a list of options, but they also told them that understand that if we strike, it'll create a ladder of escalation that will end in a general regional conflict that we are not in a position to win, that Iran will be able to destroy the totality of our infrastructure in the Persian Gulf region and the Middle East region. While we'll be able to do some harm to Iran, we won't be able to prevent them from destroying things. And if we strike their oil, they'll take out all the oil in the region. And now our economy has collapsed. It will take us, 9 to 12 months to mobilize the 900,000 troops we'll need to invade Iran. And even an invasion of Iran, how do we do it? This isn't going to be the Gulf War where Kuwait has opened up its port, Dhahran opened, Saudi Arabia opened their port. We were bringing stuff into ports in an uncontested fashion, landing our troops at airfields that were open to us. How do we get our troops into Iran? We'll have to take a port seizure. Now, the Marine Corps does that for a living. That's what they do. But the Commandant of the Marine Corps, former Commandant, Mr. Berger, General Berger, when he came on board a couple of years ago, he said that, he's reviewed the national defense strategy and the role that the Marine Corps plays in that. And he realized that the Marine Corps can't do what it's promised the president, Congress, and the American people that it should be able to do. And that is to project power in a meaningful fashion in this modern environment. He said, we're married to legacy operations where we put all our Marines on a handful of ships, but these ships are now targets with anybody who has advanced ballistic missile capability, area denial weapons. So as we bring our ships in, they will be attacked. They will be sunk. We lose all our Marines. We have nothing. So, and he said the carrier battle group's the same thing. It's a legacy system going back to World War II. We're in love with the carrier battle group, but the carrier battle group has never been subjected to the kind of anti-shipping missile fire that it would be subjected to if we went to war against Iran. I'm not saying that everything with Iran would work perfectly. It's possible that one or two ships could come in, but it's very problematic to do a port seizure when you lose 50% of your landing force in the waters, and we don't have anybody to replace them. That's the problem. There's only so many Marines, and you put them on a ship and that ship gets sunk, they're done. Now the Army's going to come in, but now you land them in Chaba Harbor, you got to, or Bandar Abbas, and now they have to advance inward. There's the whole Zagros mountain range that they have to get through. There's other mountains, there's multiple mountain ranges and deserts. It's inhospitable terrain to get to Tehran, which is the center of power. How do we do that? How do we begin to do that advance? We can't. Iran controls that area. There's millions of them. It's a war we will lose. It's a war we know we will lose. We knew we were going to lose it when they were briefed in it to Donald Trump in 2019. We know we're going to lose it today. There's not a single person in the military that believes we can fight and beat Iran in a stand-up fight today. Can't do it. Yeah, we can employ nuclear weapons, but that's just stupidity to talk about. So, you can have all these Republicans talking big. You can have all these Democrats talking big. But the bottom line is we can't beat Iran in a stand-up fight. And they know it. So all they're doing is posturing for domestic political purposes. They have to be seen as looking tough because we look so weak. Because the reality is we are so weak. So they're going to talk tough. And by blaming Iran, you distract attention away from where it really belongs, Israel. By throwing out the Iranian boogeyman, you're saying, don't pay any attention to Israel here. We're introducing you to Iran. They're the trouble. No, the trouble is Israel, 100% Israel. Israel's the problem, and the solution will be found in dealing with Israel. The United States doesn't want a war with Iran because we can't beat Iran. We can't win that war.
It seems that Avdiivka gonna turn a new Bakhmut for Ukrainians. Are they taking a lot of casualties in this battle?
The Ukrainians are being slaughtered, butchered. The Russians are taking some casualties, but nothing on the scope and scale of what happened in Bakhmut. In Bakhmut, Wagner were using, inmate units and throwing them into the battlefield without any regard for the loss of human life, and so casualties mounted. The Russians that are fighting in Avdiivka now, they are suffering losses. This is heavy fighting, but nothing along the lines. The Russians are being very slow, methodical. The Russian supremacy and firepower is real. The Ukrainians in some points of the battle can't even fire back. They have no artillery left. So the Russians are pounding them. The Fab 500s, the guided air bombs are just destroying things. This isn't going to be Bakhmut, because Bakhmut was about both sides being thrown into meat grinder. This is about Ukraine being thrown into meat grinder, and it's a very one-sided fight. And it's about to end. I think this morning the Russians broke into the most heavily fortified section. They call it Area C in Avdiivka, and I think you're seeing it's the last desperation stands on the part of the Ukrainians. I liken it to what the Germans were doing in Stalingrad in the end of January and February. A lot of fighting by some very desperate men hiding out in basements and buildings, but it was over. There's a lot of fighting left from very desperate men in basements and buildings, but it's over. They've lost. It's not just that, but Zelensky himself has said that if they don't get an infusion of aid very soon, they're going to have to retreat. Now, what does he mean? Limited tactical retreat out of Avdiivka? It's too late, man. You lost that already. They're all going to die. Retreat from Kupiansk, where, to Kharkov or beyond. The fact is, once Ukraine leaves these prepared defensive positions and starts to fall back, they don't have the troops able to execute that maneuver. Gaps will open up in the line. The Russians will penetrate those gaps, and that retreat will become a rout. So the only military option they really have is to do a precipitous withdrawal back to the Dnieper River and use that water barrier as a mechanism of stopping the Russian advance. And that's where we're at. That's something I predicted would happen earlier this year, and it's happening. I mean, this was all predictable. Military math. is a very harsh reality. When you are taking losses greater than your ability to replenish, you're in a negative factor. When your losses are less than your ability to replenish, you're in the positive factor. And Ukraine is now in the absolute negatives and Russia's in the absolute positives, and the power differential is expanding in favor of Russia as we speak. They're getting stronger every day, well-trained troops, well-equipped troops, well-led troops with more on the way. Ukraine, they're whatever you want to call them, these are not the best trained troops in the world. They're horribly led. Their morale is finished, and every day they just get weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, and eventually there will be a breaking point and the front will collapse.
How do you see this conflict between Zelensky and Zelensky? What's the reason behind this conflict?
You know, there has been a power game being played, and Zelensky was the guy that was the favorite of the CIA and MI6. Zelensky was, of course, popular, but you know, we had promoted Zelensky to the status of a Ukrainian Winston Churchill, and having given him that, you can't go against him. You have to keep him propped up as such. They're both, you know, guilty of egregious failures. Zelensky is a man who sold himself to the Ukrainians as the guy, the Messiah, around which the world will rally, and there would be a perpetual flow of money and materiel and recognition that Ukraine is the number one problem in the world, and the world is with Ukraine, and everybody will do. And you saw he got very arrogant in the late summer fall, where he was literally dictating things, not requesting but dictating, and then his request became so ridiculous and so outlandish that even Time magazine, they wrote an article about him that called him, you know, a Messiah-like character who's imbued with this delusional sense of grandeur. He's out there. He's gone. He's finished. He's finished. But Zelensky made a mistake too. You see, he gave an interview to The Economist a little while ago, where he said that the conflict is in a stalemate, and that then he said something interesting. He said, you know, I made a mistake. Well, it's interesting to have somebody say they make a mistake, because Zelensky isn't saying he made a mistake yet. But Zelensky said, I made a mistake. He said, I believed that we could engage in a process that inflicted so many casualties on the Russians that the Russians lost the will to fight, that we would break their will. And that didn't work. The Russians are still there. We haven't broken their will. We're in a stalemate. Here's the problem with that. That wasn't the war he described a year ago when he gave an interview to The Economist, when he said, I can beat these guys. I can beat them, but I need you to give me, train up 12 brigades of Ukrainian troops. Well, we did. To give me 300 tanks. We did. 500 infantry fighting vehicles. We did. 500 artillery pieces. We did. Ammunition. We did. Training. Yep. Intelligence support. Yep. We gave him all that. And he said, I can beat them. And he told us exactly what he's going to do. He said, it's 84 kilometers to Melitopol. Melitopol being a city in the region that if you take that, you sever the land bridge connecting Crimea with Russia. So he was going to take Melitopol and subject Crimea to shelling that would cause the Russians to break. This would be the war-winning strategy. Well, it's curious what he just did there. And he also said it has to be done this spring. So in that one interview, which I believe was done in December, he told the Russians how many troops the Ukrainians are going to bring to bear on the problem. He told them exactly where they're going to attack. You just have to take 84 kilometers from Melitopol and point in where it is 84, and you know they're coming through Robotyno to Tokmak. When he's going to do it and why he's going to do it. And then he's surprised that the Russians built a defense that can't be penetrated, because they knew everything about what he was trying to do. But he didn't say, I'm going to get into a meat grinder and grind these guys down. He said, I'm going to take Melitopol. That's what I'm going to do to be victorious. And he wasn't. He misled everybody. It couldn't happen. He knew it couldn't happen, because later on he said, how do you expect me to carry out an offensive when I don't have control of the air? Well, that's a question you should have asked when you were ordered to carry out the offensive. And here's the other thing about casualties. You know, as an attacking force, against a entrenched enemy, you need at a minimum 3-to-1 odds in your favor. For every one Russian dug in, you need 3 attacking soldiers. You probably need to take out up to 5 if you're going up against prepared defenses like that. 5-to-1. And the reason why you have that is that you're going to suffer casualties. The notion that the Ukrainians inflicted more casualties on the Russians than the Russians inflicted on the Ukrainians is ludicrous. It doesn't pass the smell test. It stinks. It's pure propaganda. And that's what he's selling right now. He's spinning. He's spinning his defeat. He can't acknowledge that the Ukrainians literally pounded their multi-billion-dollar NATO-provided army against a Russian brick wall that didn't yield, and now everything's gone. Everything is gone. Everything. And he's got nothing left. So he's trying to call it a stalemate, but it's not a stalemate. Stalemate implies that the Russians aren't going to do anything. The Russians right now have they've transitioned from an active defense into an active offense along the line of contact, and they're putting pressure on the Ukrainians all along the line. The Ukrainians simply don't have the troops to respond. They've poured too many troops into the battle at Avdiivka, too many troops into Kupiansk are now trapped in cauldrons being consumed. They're losing the battles around Bakhmut. They're losing everywhere, even in the Dnieper near Kherson, where they managed to put a couple battalions of Marines across the river. Those Marines are trapped now and dying. They're going nowhere. It's game, set, match. Russia has won. The problem with saying Russia's won is I use the historical analogy of the Second World War and the American experience because I'm more familiar with that. In December of 1944, the German army had been reinforced to the point where it could carry out a major offensive in the Ardennes, became known as the Battle of the Bulge. And the United States lost a lot of guys. We defended, we held, and then we launched a counterattack. General Patton's Third Army famously pivoting and relieving Bastogne and driving the Germans back. And then from early January into February into March, we pushed them out of the Ardennes. We got across the Siegfried Line and we made our way into Germany. So by 1 April, it's over. It's over. Everybody knows that it's over. You know what the bloodiest month was for American forces in the war in Europe? The bloodiest month? It wasn't December, Battle of the Bulge. It wasn't June or July, the Battle for Normandy. It wasn't the fighting for France. It wasn't the fighting for the Hürtgen Forest or the Battle of Aachen. None of that. April 1945 was the bloodiest month for U.S. forces. Why? The Germans were defeated. Why did we lose? Because the Germans fought every tooth and nail till the very end. And they went down hard. They had lost, but they went down hard. And so when I say that Ukraine has lost, they have lost. But I'm under no illusion that victory is going to be easy for Russia. The final month of this conflict could prove to be the bloodiest month for the Russians. This war will end. It will end in a Russian victory. But it's a tragedy for everybody involved, because especially now when the outcome is certain. Everybody's abandoned Ukraine. Everybody has abandoned Ukraine. Even the Wall Street Journal has abandoned Ukraine. They just did a headline story this morning saying it's time for belief in a magical Ukrainian victory to end, because even they know that there will be no Ukrainian victory, that the world must start thinking about what a Russian victory looks like and how to live with Russia under those terms, because that's the reality. That's what's going to happen. That is what's happening. And so if anybody had any humanity, they would stop the war now. Save as much of Ukraine as possible. Save as many Ukrainian lives as possible. When this war ends, they're going to need to build homes. They're going to need to rebuild cities, villages. You're going to need engineers. You're going to need construction laborers. You're going to need manpower to do this. The genetic foundation of the nation of Ukraine is being wasted. All that talent that Ukraine is going to need to rebuild is being bled out on the battlefield. The same thing with Russia. Russia's been fortunate enough to have won the propaganda war at home. What I mean by that is that the Russian people have fallen in behind the political leadership about this war. They believe in this war. They believe this war needs to be won, and they're willing to pay the price necessary to win this war. And as a result, hundreds of thousands of Russian men have left their jobs, good paying jobs, left their homes, left their families, left their loved ones, and willingly gone to a war that is defined as a meat grinder. This isn't World War I, where guys lined up and were marching off for vain dreams of glory. These are guys that know they're being fed into the meat grinder. They know what they're going to, but they go anyways because they say, we must finish this now. These are the guys that Russia needs when this war is over to rebuild. And they're dying on the battlefield. Every day that goes by, the very men that both Ukraine and Russia need to rebuild from this catastrophic conflict are dying in the fields of Zaporizhia, in the villages and towns of Donetsk, in the forests of Lugansk, in the swamps of Kherson. This war needs to end so that these men can live, so these men can do what they're supposed to do, which is to build their countries, make their countries stronger, make their countries better. Not so they can go to war against each other, but they can live in peace, in harmony with each other, as they're supposed to do. I just interviewed I interviewed a Russian journalist who's with the Russian forces, and he's involved in the battle for Avdiivka, and he said it's a tough fight because the guys we're fighting are us. They're the same people as we are. They're the same stubborn guys that we are. They won't surrender. They'll fight to the death because they're Russians. They may call themselves Ukrainians, but they're Russians. Russian spirit, Russian blood, the Russian soul. This is tragedy. This is a huge tragedy. And hopefully it comes to an end as soon as possible. It will be a Russian victory. And it's incumbent upon the West to learn to live with the reality of that victory. And I will just say this: I can't predict the future, but I will tell you that Russia doesn't have revenge on their mind. Yes, there will be denazification. Yes, the Banderist movement will be eradicated. But Russia's not looking to punish Europe. They're not looking to invade Poland, invade the Baltics. Russia wants peace. And when this war ends, Russia will be looking for a way to turn their victory into a vehicle that allows for a new European security framework where both sides respect their respective spheres of influence and learn to peacefully cohabitate. Russia's shown that it can survive economically without being plugged into Europe. Would Russia like to plug into Europe again? Of course, who wouldn't? It's a market. But they're never going to allow Europe to dominate Russia as they once did. The relationship will be forever changed, but it should be a relationship nonetheless, one where Europe doesn't have to worry about building its own massive armies. It's spending money they don't have because of their faltering economies to build tanks and airplanes and artillery pieces and artillery shells. They should be focused instead on rebuilding their own devastated economies that were damaged by their own self-destructive policies of trying to sanction Russia. Well, it's backfired. Russia's standing. Russia's strong. The Wall Street Journal admits this, that Russia has beat us on the sanctions game. They beat us militarily. They beat us diplomatically. Everywhere you look, Russia's treated with respect around the world. It's the West that's becoming increasingly isolated. It started with Ukraine, but now the West has jumped in on the Israeli bandwagon, and that isolation is becoming even more manifest. No, but it's tragedy. But again, I do believe that this war is going to end sooner rather than later. This is not going to be a long-term stalemate. Ukraine is finished.
Would Odessa and Nikolaev end up in the hand of Russians, in your opinion?
If this war continues, yes. Let's look at the realities here. What the Zelensky government has done, what the Zelensky's military leadership has done, is turn Odessa into a place where strikes can be carried out against Crimea. They've already compelled Russia to take a strategic withdrawal from Sevastopol, the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, and move it to ports because it's vulnerable to attack. if I were advising the president of Russia, I would say that Odessa must be Russian. We must control the coast. We must, in order to protect Crimea, we have to secure Odessa. Didn't always have to be that way, but Ukraine's actions have made that, a reality. Now, I believe that the Russian government is pragmatic, and if the opportunity came for a peaceful resolution to this war on terms that were favorable to Russia, meaning that Russia does get the denazification, no NATO, etc., that conditions could be created that allowed Odessa to remain under Ukrainian political control, but it would be a demilitarized zone. Ukraine will never again be allowed to project military power into Odessa so long as they have the potential of resuming the conflict with Russia. So that's a problem. If the fighting continues in Kharkov, I mean, once Russia takes Kharkov, they ain't giving it back. Once Russia takes any territory now, they're not giving it back, especially territory that has a significant ethnic Russian population. So the best thing for Ukraine to do right now is to stop the war and pray that Russia leaves Kharkov, and then hope for the best. But if they continue, yes. I mean, Russian leadership, Dmitry Medvedev and others, have pretty much said as much, that this will end with Russia gaining control of 5 more territories. And that includes Kharkov, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv. It's Ukraine's choice. What do they want Ukraine to look like when this is over? They
Do
can
you
lose
think
20%
that
of their country, or they can lose 50% of their country. It's up to them.